The Yenisei Kyrgyz, also known as the Ancient Kyrgyz or the Khyagas, Khakas, were an ancient Turkic people who dwelled along the upper Yenisei River in the southern portion of the Minusinsk Depression from the 3rd century BCE to the 13th century CE. The heart of their homeland was the forested Tannu-Ola mountain range, known in ancient times as the Lower Kogmen Mountains, in modern-day Tuva, just north of Mongolia. The Sayan Mountains were also included in their territory at different times. The Kyrgyz Khaganate existed from 550 to 1219 CE. In 840, it took over the leadership of the Turkic Khaganate from the Uyghurs, expanding the state from the Yenisei territories into the Central Asia and Tarim Basin. The Yenisei Kyrgyz mass migration to the Jeti-su resulted in the formation of the modern Kyrgyz Republic, land of the modern-day Kyrgyz. According to recent historical findings, Kyrgyz history dates back to 201 BC. The Yenisei Kyrgyz correlated with Khakas culture and may perhaps be correlated to the Tashtik culture. They were known as Jeti-su, Chinese, or Sayan, Chinese, in Chinese historical texts, but first appeared as Getkin, or Kokuan, Chinese, or Jiankan, or Qiankuan, Chinese, in Han period records. By the fall of the Gokturk Empire in the 8th century CE, the Yenisei Kyrgyz had established their own thriving state based on the Gokturk model. They had adopted the Orkhon script of the Gokturks and established trading ties with China in the Abbasid Caliphate in Central Asia and Middle East. The Kyrgyz Khagans of the Yenisei Kyrgyz Khaganate claimed descent from the Chinese general Li Ling, grandson of the famous Han dynasty general Li Guang. Li Ling was captured by the Xiongnu and defected in the 1st century BCE, and since the Tang royalty family also claimed descent from Li Guang, the Kyrgyz Khagan was therefore recognized as a member of the Tang imperial family. Emperor Zongzong of Tang had said to them that your nation and ours are of the same ancestral clan, Zong. You are not like other foreigners. In 758, the Uyghurs killed the Kyrgyz Khan and the Kyrgyz came under the rule of the Uyghur Khaganate. However, the Yenisei Kyrgyz spent much of their time in a state of rebellion. In 840 they succeeded in sacking the Uyghur capital, Orda-Beylik in Mongolia's Orkhon Valley, and driving the Uyghurs out of Mongolia entirely. On February 13, 843 at killed the foreigners' mountain, the Tang Chinese inflicted a devastating defeat upon the Uyghur Khagan's forces. But rather than replace the Uyghurs as the lords of Mongolia, the Yenisei Kyrgyz continued to live in their traditional homeland and exist as they had for centuries. The defeat and collapse of the Uyghur Khaganate triggered a massive migration of Uyghurs from Mongolia into Turfan, Kumul, and Gansu, where they founded the kingdom of Kocho and Gansu Uyghur Kingdom. When Genghis Khan came to power in the early 13th century, the Yenisei Kyrgyz submitted peacefully to him and were absorbed into his Mongol Empire, putting an end to their independent state. During the time of the Mongol Empire, the territory of the Yenisei Kyrgyz in northern Mongolia was turned into an agricultural colony called Kamchenchik. Kublai Khan, who founded the Yuan dynasty, also sent Mongolian and Chinese officials, along with colonists, to serve as judges in the Kyrgyz and Tuva regions. Some of the Yenisei Kyrgyz were relocated into the Dzungar Khanate by the Dzungars. In 1761, after the Dzungars were defeated by the Qing, some Olat, a tribe of Uyghur-speaking Dzungars, were deported to Nani Basin in northeastern China, Manchuria, and a group of Yenisei Kyrgyz were also deported along with the Olat. The Kyrgyz moved to northeastern China became known as the Fuyu Kyrgyz, but they have now mostly merged with the Mongol and Chinese population. The descendants of the Yenisei Kyrgyz today are the Kyrgyz, Khakas, and Altai peoples. Culturally and linguistically, the Yenisei Kyrgyz were Turkic. The Kyrgyz were described in Tang dynasty texts as having primarily Caucasian features, with some having East Asian features. According to the Tang Huiyao, 961 CE, article on Jidu, the Kyrgyz, which very likely comes from the Su Huiyao that Yang Xiaofeng and others completed in 852, citing Gujian, who was the protector general of Anxi. During the reign period of Kaiyuan of Emperor Xuanzong, Gujian composed a record of the western regions, in which he said the people of the Jiangkan state all have red hair and green eyes. The ones with dark eyes were descendants of Li Ling. It further mentioned that the name Zayajayasi, by which the Kyrgyz were then known, was what the Uyghurs called them and had the meaning yellow head and red face, although confusingly it was also a name Kyrgyz themselves used. Since medieval Muslim writers described contemporary Turks as broad-faced people with small eyes, and noted that Tibetans and Turks resembled each other so much Arabs could not tell the difference between those two groups, and that on Western Turkic coins the faces of the governor and governess are clearly Mongoloid, A roundish face, narrow eyes, and the portrait have definite Old Turk features: long hair, absence of headdress of the governor, but tricorn headdress of the governess. The description of the Kyrgyz as tall, blue-eyed blondes excited the early interest of scholars, who assumed that Kyrgyz might not have originally been Turkic in language. Golden considered Kyrgyzs to be Paleo-Siberians Turkicized under Turkic leadership. Jeti cited the opinions of various scholars who had proposed to see them as Germanic, Slav, or Ket, while he himself, following Kastrin and Schott, favored a Samoyed origin on the basis of an etymology for a supposed Kyrgyz word kazan or kaz for iron. However, Palablanc argued, "As far as I can see, the only basis for the assumption that the Kyrgyz were not originally Turkic in language is the fact that they are described as blondes, hardly an acceptable argument in the light of present-day ideas about the independence of language and race." As Jeti himself admitted, other evidence about the Kyrgyz language in Tang sources shows clearly that at the time they were Turkic-speaking, and there is no earlier evidence at all about their language. Even the word kazan or kazme, I think, be Turkic. The Tannu-Ola says, whenever the sky rains iron, they gather it and use it. They call it jiasha, lmcksa. They make knives and swords with it that are very sharp. The Tang Huiyao is the same except that it leaves out the foreign word jiasha. Raining iron must surely refer to meteorites. The editor who copied the passage into the Xian Tangshu unfortunately misunderstood it and changed it to, whenever it rains, their custom is always to get iron, which is rather nonsensical. Jeti unfortunately used only the Xian Tangshu passage without referring to the Tannu-Ola. His restoration of kazan or kaz seems quite acceptable, but I doubt that word simply meant iron. It seems rather to refer specifically to meteorite or meteoric iron. American Turkologist Michael Drop adheres to the same opinion. A number of researchers have been tempted to see the early Kyrgyz as a non-Turkic people or, at the very least, an ethnically mixed people with a large non-Turkic component. Many scholars have supported this idea after identifying what they believe to be examples of non-Turkic, particularly Samoyed, words among the Kyrgyz words preserved in Chinese sources. It should be noted, however, that the connection between language and race is highly inconclusive. The physical appearance of the Kyrgyz can no more be considered as indicating that they were not a Turkic people than can the lexical appearance of a few possibly non-Turkic words, whose presence in the Kyrgyz language can be explained through the common practice of linguistic borrowing. The Kyrgyz inscriptions of the Yenisei, 8th century CE and later, are in fact written in a completely Turkic language, and Tang Chinese sources state clearly that the Kyrgyz written and spoken language at the time was identical to that of the Turkic Uyghurs, Chinese Huihu. Most of the Kyrgyz words preserved in Chinese sources are, in fact, Turkic. There is no reason to assume a non-Turkic origin for the Kyrgyz, although that possibility cannot be discounted. The Yenisei Kyrgyz had a mixed economy based on traditional nomadic animal breeding, mostly horses and cattle, and agriculture. According to Chinese records, they grew Himalayan rye, barley, millet, and wheat. They were also skilled iron workers, jewelry makers, potters, and weavers. Their homes were traditional nomadic tents and, in the agricultural areas, wood and bark huts. Their farming settlements were protected by log palisades. The resources of their forested homeland, mainly fur, allowed the Yenisei Kyrgyz to become prosperous merchants as well. They maintained trading ties with China, Tibet, the Abbasid Caliphate of the Middle East, and many local tribes. Kyrgyz horses were also renowned for their large size and speed. The 10th century Persian text Hudud-ala-Lan described the Kyrgyz as people who venerate the fire and burn the dead, and that they were nomads who hunted. The trisyllabic forms with Chinese sz for Turkic final z appear only from the end of 8th century onward. Before the time we have a series of Chinese transcriptions referring to the same people and stretching back to the 2nd century BCE, which end either in N or T. Gekan, EMCKRJKKWN, 2nd century BCE. Shiji 110, Hanshu 94a. Jiankan, EMCKHNKWN, 1st century BCE onward. Hanshu 70. Kiga, EMCKTKWT, 6th century. Zhongshu 50. Higa, EMC Gamma TKWT, 6th century. Suishu 84. Jiga, EMC KTKWT, 6th to 8th century. Tongdian 200, Old Book of Tang 194b, and Tang Huiyao 100. Neither N nor T provides a good equivalent for Z. The most serious attempt to explain these forms seems still to be that of Paul Pelliot in 1920. Pelliot suggested that Middle Chinese T stands for Turkic Z, which would be quite unusual and would need supporting evidence, but then his references to Mongol plurals in T suggest that he thinks that the name of the Kyrgyz, like that of the Turks, first became known to the Chinese through Mongol-speaking intermediaries. There is still less plausibility in the suggestion that the Kyrgyz, who first became known as a people conquered by that Sayamnu and then re-emerged associated with other Turkic peoples in the 6th century, should have had Mongol-style suffixes attached to all the various forms of their name that were transcribed into Chinese up to the 9th century. The change of R to Z in Turkic which is implied by the Chinese forms of the name Kyrgyz should not give any comfort to those who want to explain Mongolian and Tungusic cognates with R as Turkic loanwords. The peoples mentioned in sources of the Han period that can be identified as Turkic was Dingling, later TL, out of whom the Uyghurs emerged, the Jiankan, later Kyrgyz, the Zimli, later Sur/Shwab, and possibly also the Hujit or Wujit, were all, at that period, north and west of the Xiongnu and general area where we find the Kyrgyz at the beginning of Tang.